I am Zaria, 32 years old, and just because of my younger sister, my father threw me and my 3-day-old baby out into a freezing snowstorm. They had no idea I had just inherited $2.5 billion from my grandfather. Only 24 hours later, I made their entire world collapse. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to a family who severely underestimated your worth. The heavy brass handles of my family's Atlanta estate felt like ice against my back as I stood in the grand marble foyer. My 3-day-old son Trey was whimpering against my chest, swaddled tightly in a fleece blanket. Outside the towering glass windows, an unprecedented winter storm was tearing through the city, dropping temperatures to dangerous lows and icing over the roads. Inside the sprawling mansion, the fireplaces roared and the heated floors hummed with warmth. But the coldest thing in that room was not the weather outside. It was the look of absolute disgust on my father Desmond's face. "I told you this morning you needed to be gone." "Zaria," my father barked, his voice echoing off the vaulted ceilings. He snatched my blue diaper bag from the entryway bench and marched toward the front door. The zipper caught pulling open and sending a cascade of pacifiers, baby wipes, and a spare onesie scattering across the polished marble. "You showing up here unannounced to recover from childbirth was a massive mistake. I have important people arriving in less than 2 hours, and I will not have you loitering in my hallways looking like a charity case." I clutched Trey tighter, trying to steady my breathing, despite the sharp pain still radiating through my abdomen from the delivery. "Dad, the city just issued a state of emergency." I pleaded, keeping my voice as level as possible. "The highways are completely frozen over. I just need to stay in the guest room for one night until the ice melts. I will stay completely out of sight. I promise you will not even know we are here." "Absolutely not," a sharp voice interrupted. My younger sister Chantel descended the grand curved staircase like she was making an entrance at a fashion show. She wore a custom-tailored emerald silk dress that hugged her perfectly. Beside her was her husband Connor, a white tech bro with a smug smile and an expensive bourbon swirling in his crystal glass. Chantel was the undisputed golden child of our family. From the moment she could walk, my parents had poured millions into her pageant dresses, her lavish vacations, and her superficial lifestyle, while treating my career as a financial technology consultant like an embarrassing hobby. "A crying newborn is completely going to ruin the aesthetic of our networking mixer," Chantel sneered, stopping a few feet away from me and waving her hand defensively, as if my postpartum exhaustion was contagious. "Connor has elite angel investors flying in by private helicopter tonight to fund his new app startup. This is the most important night of our lives, and we need the entire house for the VIP reception. We simply do not have space for you and your fatherless child to be taking up oxygen in the guest wing." Connor took a slow sip of his drink and offered me a patronizing smile. "Look, Zaria, I get that your timing is bad, but business is business. You chose to be a single mother working some boring corporate job. You should have planned your life better instead of running back to your parents' house asking for handouts. If you stay, the investors might mistake you for the hired help, and that just sends the wrong message about our brand." The sheer audacity of his words made my blood boil. I had built a successful life entirely on my own, away from their constant belittling. The only reason I was standing in this foyer was because my water broke 3 weeks early while I was in town, finalizing a massive client merger. I had nowhere else to go straight from the hospital, and foolishly believed that basic human decency might compel my own flesh and blood to offer me shelter during a natural disaster. "You cannot be serious," I said, staring at my sister. "Chantel, you are willing to push your newborn nephew out into sub-zero temperatures so you can drink champagne with strangers. You always do this." Zaria Chantel snapped, her eyes flashing with irritation. "You always try to play the victim and ruin my moments. You show up uninvited and expect us to drop everything to accommodate your mediocrity. Just like when you tried to ruin my debutante ball by begging Dad to pay for your college tuition instead of buying my custom gown. You are so incredibly selfish, and I will not let you sabotage Connor's big night." Desmond stepped forward, his face flushed with anger. He kicked a stray baby pacifier across the marble floor. "You heard your sister," he demanded. My reputation is on the line tonight. I am co-hosting this event, and I need everything to be flawless. Grab your trash and get out of my house before I call the security team to physically remove you. I looked toward the parlor hoping for a final sliver of mercy as my mother Yvonne stepped out into the foyer. She was wearing her signature pearls and a tight smile. She had watched the entire exchange from the doorway. Mothers are supposed to protect their children. They are supposed to be a safe harbor. But Yvonne had always viewed me as an inconvenient blemish on her perfect socialite image. "Mom," I said, my voice finally cracking just a fraction. "Please, it is 12 degrees outside. Trey is only 3 days old." Yvonne walked slowly toward me, her heels clicking sharply against the stone floor. She stopped just out of arm's reach, opened her designer clutch, and pulled out a crumpled $20 bill. She held it out to me, holding it between two fingers like it was contaminated. "Take the bus down to the shelter downtown," Yvonne said, her voice dripping with artificial sympathy. "They have warming centers for women in your unfortunate situation. This is tough love, Zarya. We cannot keep enabling your failures. Maybe freezing for a night will finally teach you how to be responsible. Now go before the caterers arrive." I stared at the $20 bill fluttering slightly in her perfectly manicured hand. The profound sickness of their cruelty washed over me, erasing any remaining trace of familial loyalty I had left. I did not take the money. I did not cry. I did not scream or beg or throw a tantrum to give them the satisfaction of calling me unstable. I simply bent down, wincing at the pain in my stitches, and slung the strap of my torn diaper bag over my shoulder. I pulled Trey closer to my chest, ensuring his fleece blanket covered his tiny head completely. I looked my father directly in the eyes. Then I looked at my mother, my sister, and the arrogant man she had married. I committed every single detail of their smug, satisfied faces to memory. "You are right," I said, my voice dropping to a calm, terrifying whisper. "I should take responsibility for my own life. Enjoy your party." I turned around and pushed the heavy brass doors open myself. The brutal winter wind slammed into me, instantly stealing the breath from my lungs. Snow swirled furiously across the grand circular driveway, burying the manicured hedges in white. Before I even reached the bottom of the front steps, I heard the heavy oak doors slam shut behind me, followed by the distinct metallic click of the deadbolt locking. I stood alone in the howling blizzard, the cold biting through my thin wool coat. But a strange burning heat radiated from deep within my chest. They thought they had just discarded their weakest link. They thought they had finally put the family scapegoat in her proper place. They had no idea who I really was, shielding my sleeping son from the wind. I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out my phone. I did not look up the bus schedule. I did not search for the nearest homeless shelter or call a cheap taxi. I bypassed all my regular contacts and dialed a highly encrypted private concierge number. It was a line tied to a secret wealth management account my family knew absolutely nothing about. The call connected on the first ring. A crisp, professional voice answered immediately. "Good evening, Miss Zarya. How may we assist you tonight?" "I need extraction," I said, my voice steady against the howling wind. "Send the primary vehicle to the estate immediately. Have Mr. Sterling meet me at the downtown penthouse. It is time to execute the final documents." "Understood, Ms. Zarya," the voice replied without hesitation. "Your vehicle is 3 minutes away." I ended the call and slipped the phone back into my pocket. I looked back at the glowing windows of the mansion, where my family was busy preparing to impress their wealthy investors. They had thrown me into the cold, expecting me to freeze and beg for mercy. They did not know that by tomorrow night, I would own the very ground they stood on. I am Zarya, 32 years old, and just because of my younger sister, my father threw me and my 3-day-old baby out into a freezing snowstorm. They had no idea I had just inherited $2.5 billion from my grandfather. Only 24 hours later, I made their entire world collapse. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to a family who severely underestimated your worth. The heavy brass handles of my family's Atlanta estate felt like ice against my back as I stood in the grand marble foyer. My 3-day-old son Trey was whimpering against my chest, swaddled tightly in a fleece blanket. Outside the towering glass windows, an unprecedented winter storm was tearing through the city, dropping temperatures to dangerous lows and icing over the roads. Inside the sprawling mansion, the fireplaces roared and the heated floors hummed with warmth. But the coldest thing in that room was not the weather outside. It was the look of absolute disgust on my father Desmond's face. "I told you this morning you needed to be gone." "Zarya," my father barked, his voice echoing off the vaulted ceilings. He snatched my blue diaper bag from the entryway bench and marched toward the front door. The zipper caught pulling open and sending a cascade of pacifiers, baby wipes, and a spare onesie scattering across the polished marble. You showing up here unannounced to recover from childbirth was a massive mistake. I have important people arriving in less than 2 hours, and I will not have you loitering in my hallways looking like a charity case. I clutched Trey tighter, trying to steady my breathing, despite the sharp pain still radiating through my abdomen from the delivery. "Dad, the city just issued a state of emergency," I pleaded, keeping my voice as level as possible. "The highways are completely frozen over. I just need to stay in the guest room for one night until the ice melts. I will stay completely out of sight. I promise you will not even know we are here." "Absolutely not," a sharp voice interrupted. My younger sister Chantel descended the grand curved staircase like she was making an entrance at a fashion show. She wore a custom-tailored emerald silk dress that hugged her perfectly. Beside her was her husband Connor, a white tech bro, with a smug smile and an expensive bourbon swirling in his crystal glass. Chantel was the undisputed golden child of our family. From the moment she could walk, my parents had poured millions into her pageant dresses, her lavish vacations, and her superficial lifestyle, while treating my career as a financial technology consultant like an embarrassing hobby. "A crying newborn is completely going to ruin the aesthetic of our networking mixer," Chantel sneered, stopping a few feet away from me and waving her hand defensively, as if my postpartum exhaustion was contagious. "Connor has elite angel investors flying in by private helicopter tonight to fund his new app startup. This is the most important night of our lives, and we need the entire house for the VIP reception. We simply do not have space for you and your fatherless child to be taking up oxygen in the guest wing." Connor took a slow sip of his drink and offered me a patronizing smile. "Look, Zarya, I get that your timing is bad, but business is business. You chose to be a single mother, working some boring corporate job. You should have planned your life better instead of running back to your parents' house asking for handouts. If you stay, the investors might mistake you for the hired help, and that just sends the wrong message about our brand." The sheer audacity of his words made my blood boil. I had built a successful life entirely on my own, away from their constant belittling. The only reason I was standing in this foyer was because my water broke 3 weeks early while I was in town finalizing a massive client merger. I had nowhere else to go, straight from the hospital, and foolishly believed that basic human decency might compel my own flesh and blood to offer me shelter during a natural disaster. "You cannot be serious," I said, staring at my sister. "Chantel, you are willing to push your newborn nephew out into sub-zero temperatures so you can drink champagne with strangers. You always do this." Zarya Chantel snapped, her eyes flashing with irritation. "You always try to play the victim and ruin my moments. You show up uninvited and expect us to drop everything to accommodate your mediocrity. Just like when you tried to ruin my debutante ball by begging Dad to pay for your college tuition instead of buying my custom gown. You are so incredibly selfish, and I will not let you sabotage Connor's big night." Desmond stepped forward, his face flushed with anger. He kicked a stray baby pacifier across the marble floor. "You heard your sister," he demanded. "My reputation is on the line tonight. I am co-hosting this event and I need everything to be flawless. Grab your trash and get out of my house before I call the security team to physically remove you." I looked toward the parlor, hoping for a final sliver of mercy, as my mother Yvonne stepped out into the foyer. She was wearing her signature pearls and a tight smile. She had watched the entire exchange from the doorway. Mothers are supposed to protect their children. They are supposed to be a safe harbor. But Yvonne had always viewed me as an inconvenient blemish on her perfect socialite image. "Mom," I said, my voice finally cracking just a fraction. "Please, it is 12 degrees outside. Trey is only 3 days old." Yvonne walked slowly toward me, her heels clicking sharply against the stone floor. She stopped just out of arm's reach, opened her designer clutch, and pulled out a crumpled $20 bill. She held it out to me, holding it between two fingers like it was contaminated. "Take the bus down to the shelter downtown," Yvonne said, her voice dripping with artificial sympathy. "They have warming centers for women in your unfortunate situation. This is tough love, Zarya. We cannot keep enabling your failures. Maybe freezing for a night will finally teach you how to be responsible. Now go before the caterers arrive." I stared at the $20 bill fluttering slightly in her perfectly manicured hand. The profound sickness of their cruelty washed over me, erasing any remaining trace of familial loyalty I had left. I did not take the money. I did not cry. I did not scream or beg or throw a tantrum to give them the satisfaction of calling me unstable. I simply bent down, wincing at the pain in my stitches, and slung the strap of my torn diaper bag over my shoulder. I pulled Trey closer to my chest, ensuring his fleece blanket covered his tiny head completely. I looked my father directly in the eyes. Then I looked at my mother, my sister, and the arrogant man she had married. I committed every single detail of their smug, satisfied faces to memory. "You are right," I said, my voice dropping to a calm, terrifying whisper. "I should take responsibility for my own life. Enjoy your party." I turned around and pushed the heavy brass doors open myself. The brutal winter wind slammed it into me, instantly stealing the breath from my lungs. Snow swirled furiously across the grand circular driveway, burying the manicured hedges in white. Before I even reached the bottom of the front steps, I heard the heavy oak doors slam shut behind me, followed by the distinct metallic click of the deadbolt locking. I stood alone in the howling blizzard, the cold biting through my thin wool coat. But a strange burning heat radiated from deep within my chest. They thought they had just discarded their weakest link. They thought they had finally put the family scapegoat in her proper place. They had no idea who I really was, shielding my sleeping son from the wind. I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out my phone. I did not look up the bus schedule. I did not search for the nearest homeless shelter or call a cheap taxi. I bypassed all my regular contacts and dialed a highly encrypted private concierge number. It was a line tied to a secret wealth management account my family knew absolutely nothing about. The call connected on the first ring. A crisp professional voice answered immediately. "Good evening, Ms. Zarya. How may we assist you tonight?" "I need extraction," I said, my voice steady against the howling wind. "Send the primary vehicle to the estate immediately. Have Mr. Sterling meet me at the downtown penthouse. It is time to execute the final documents." "Understood, Ms. Zarya," the voice replied without hesitation. "Your vehicle is 3 minutes away." I ended the call and slipped the phone back into my pocket. I looked back at the glowing windows of the mansion where my family was busy preparing to impress their wealthy investors. They had thrown me into the cold, expecting me to freeze and beg for mercy. They did not know that by tomorrow night I would own the very ground they stood on. The wind howled, whipping snow against my legs as I stood on the edge of the circular driveway. My teeth chattered, but I kept my body angled to shield Trey from the biting frost. I did not have to wait long. Less than 3 minutes later, a sleek, jet-black Maybach pierced through the blinding white storm, its heavy tires crunching over the iced pavement. The vehicle glided to a halt right in front of me, an imposing fortress of impenetrable tinted glass and polished steel. Before the engine even settled into a low purr, the driver's side door sprang open. Elias, a broad-shouldered man in a pristine charcoal suit, stepped out into the freezing storm without a single flinch. He did not ask questions. He did not offer empty sympathies. He simply opened the rear passenger door, bowing his head slightly in profound deference. "Good evening, Ms. Zarya," Elias said, his voice a steady rumble that cut through the howling wind. "I have the cabin temperature set to 72 degrees, and the rear seat warmers are fully engaged for you and the young master." "Thank you, Elias," I murmured, stepping out of the brutal Georgia winter and sinking into the immaculate cream-colored leather interior. The heavy door clicked shut behind me, instantly silencing the raging storm outside. The cabin was a sanctuary of heat and soft ambient lighting. I carefully pulled the fleece blanket back from Trey's face. His tiny chest rose and fell in a steady, peaceful rhythm. He had slept through the entire eviction, completely oblivious to the fact that his own grandparents had just condemned him to the freezing cold. As Elias smoothly navigated the Maybach down the winding ice-covered driveway of my parents' estate, I looked back at the towering mansion one last time. The massive crystal chandelier in the foyer glowed brightly through the frosted glass doors. They were probably already popping champagne, eager to impress Connor's tech investors, completely unbothered by my absence. My phone suddenly vibrated against my thigh, breaking the silence in the back of the car. I pulled it out to see a text message illuminating the screen. It was from Chantel. "Hope you and your fatherless mistake enjoy the bus stop. Do not bother crawling back here tomorrow begging for a warm bed when you realize how pathetic your life is. Mom and Dad are completely done with you. Have a nice life as a single mother failure." I stared at the glowing words, feeling a sharp, familiar ache in my chest. It was the same venomous tone Chantel had used our entire lives, backed by the unwavering support of our parents. Desmond and Yvonne had spent the last 30 years cultivating an image of Black excellence and high society perfection, but their version of perfection only ever applied to Chantel. When I chose to pursue a rigorous degree in financial technology, working long hours, to build a legitimate consulting firm, they called me boring and masculine. They mocked my late nights and told me I was wasting my youth staring at spreadsheets. Meanwhile, they poured millions into Chantel's superficial existence. They bought her luxury cars every time she wrecked one. They financed her string of failed vanity businesses, from a boutique candle shop to a luxury dog clothing line, all of which collapsed within months. When she brought home Connor, a white tech bro with a silver tongue and an empty bank account, Desmond practically tripped over himself to fund Connor's flashy app startup. Desmond remortgaged his own commercial properties just to pay for Chantel and Connor's extravagant destination wedding in Lake Como, desperate to maintain their status among Atlanta's elite. I was always the scapegoat, the designated punching bag, the daughter who was expected to sit quietly in the corner while they celebrated Chantel's mediocrity. But I never needed their money. My consulting firm had quietly made me a self-made millionaire by the time I was 28. I was completely financially independent, which only made them resent me more because they could not control me. But there was one person in the family who saw through their toxic, shallow facade. Granddad Harrison. I swiped left on Chantel's message and permanently blocked her number. I would not shed a single tear over people who viewed my son as a burden. I settled back into the heated leather, watching the frozen streets of Atlanta blur past the tinted windows. Granddad Harrison was my father's father, a self-made logistics magnate who built a massive shipping empire from a single delivery truck in the 1970s. He was a brilliant, ruthless businessman who despised Desmond's obsession with country club politics and flashy cars. Granddad Harrison saw my analytical mind, my quiet resilience, and my refusal to beg for Desmond's approval. For the last 5 years of his life, he secretly mentored me. We spent countless hours in his private study, analyzing market trends, dissecting corporate acquisitions, and discussing the true nature of generational wealth. When he passed away 3 weeks ago, Desmond and Yvonne threw a massive performative funeral, eagerly anticipating the reading of the will. They assumed Desmond, as the only son, would inherit the entire empire. They had already started spending money. They did not have taking out bridge loans to fund Connor's sinking startup based on the assumption of a massive impending inheritance. What they did not know was that Granddad Harrison had structured his estate with impenetrable, airtight precision, and he had trusted only one person to take the reins. The Maybach did not head toward the cheap motels on the outskirts of the city. Elias bypassed the commercial district entirely, steering the heavy vehicle toward Buckhead, the wealthiest and most exclusive neighborhood in Atlanta. We approached the Sovereign Spire, a towering glass skyscraper that housed the city's most elite residents. Elias did not pull up to the main entrance. He turned down a hidden private ramp that led into a highly secure underground parking facility. The massive steel gate rolled up automatically as the vehicle approached, recognizing the encrypted signal from the Maybach. We glided into a brightly lit, pristine garage filled with exotic cars, pulling to a smooth stop right in front of a private gold-plated elevator bank. Elias stepped out and opened my door. The ambient air in the private garage was perfectly climate-controlled. "We have arrived," Ms. Zaria Elias said respectfully. "Mr. Sterling is waiting for you upstairs." I adjusted the blanket around Trey, stepping out of the vehicle with a renewed sense of purpose. The exhaustion of childbirth and the sting of my family's betrayal were entirely eclipsed by the cold, heavy weight of power settling over my shoulders. I approached the private elevator. The biometric scanner projected a red line across my eyes. A pleasant chime echoed in the quiet garage, and the heavy gold doors slid open. I stepped inside the mahogany-paneled cab, and the elevator immediately shot upward, bypassing every other floor in the building. When the doors parted on the top floor, I stepped into the grand foyer of a sprawling multi-million-dollar penthouse. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a breathtaking panoramic view of the frozen Atlanta skyline. The city looked small from up here. Standing by the massive marble fireplace was a tall, distinguished older African-American man in an immaculate navy suit. It was Mr. Sterling, the managing partner of the most powerful corporate law firm in the Southeast, and Grandad Harrison's most trusted personal attorney and executor. He held a thick black leather briefcase in one hand and a steaming cup of tea in the other. He turned as I entered, his sharp eyes taking in my disheveled state, the diaper bag and the sleeping newborn strapped to my chest. He did not ask what had happened. He already knew the kind of people my parents were. "Good evening, Zaria," Mr. Sterling said, his voice rich and steady. "I trust Elias made your journey comfortable despite the hazardous conditions outside." "He did," I replied, walking into the warm, expansive living room. The penthouse was dead quiet, insulated completely from the storm raging against the glass. Mr. Sterling set his teacup down on the glass coffee table and unlatched his briefcase. He pulled out a massive stack of legal documents bound in thick premium parchment. He laid them out meticulously across the table, arranging several gold-plated pens beside them. "Your grandfather anticipated that your father might attempt something foolish during his financial desperation," Mr. Sterling said smoothly. "That is why we expedited the final transition protocols. The estate has cleared probate faster than anticipated due to the blind trusts we established last year." I stepped closer to the table, looking down at the heavy legal jargon, the corporate seals, and the endless lines waiting for my signature. "Are they ready?" I asked. Mr. Sterling nodded, a slight knowing smile touching the corners of his mouth. "Everything is fully prepared. Once you apply your signature to these transfer deeds, the transition of power will be absolute and irreversible. You will assume total control of the Harrison Logistics empire, the entire real estate portfolio, and the primary private equity holding firm." He tapped the final document in the stack. "You will officially be the sole beneficiary and executor of a $2.5 billion trust," Mr. Sterling confirmed. "Your father has absolutely zero legal standing to contest this." I looked down at Trey, who let out a soft, contented sigh in his sleep. Desmond and Chantel had thrown us out into the snow like garbage, treating us as an embarrassing burden that needed to be discarded. They thought they held all the power. They thought their country club memberships and leased luxury cars made them untouchable. I picked up the heavy gold pen. I did not hesitate for a single second. I pressed the tip to the paper and signed my name with sharp, deliberate strokes. Page after page, document after document, I signed away my old life and claimed my grandfather's legacy. With the final strokes of the pen, the transfer was complete. I was no longer just Zaria the consultant. I was a billionaire heiress, the majority shareholder of a massive corporate empire. Mr. Sterling gathered the documents, his expression turning gravely serious. He reached back into his briefcase and pulled out a secondary, highly classified dossier wrapped in a red security band. "Congratulations, Ms. Harrison," he said formally. "Now that you are the legal head of the estate, there is a secondary matter regarding the private equity firm that demands your immediate attention. It concerns your father's real estate holding company and your brother-in-law's technology startup." He handed me the heavy red dossier. "I suggest you review these financial audits tonight," Mr. Sterling continued, his voice dropping an octave. "What you are about to discover regarding your family's current financial situation is incredibly disturbing." I took the red folder, the thick paper heavy in my hands. The game had just fundamentally changed. The mahogany desk stretched between me and Mr. Sterling, like a bridge between my past and my future. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, the Atlanta blizzard raged on, But inside this impenetrable penthouse, the air was completely still. I gently laid Trey in a plush bassinet. Elias had quietly rolled into the room. My son let out a soft sigh, his tiny fists relaxing. He was safe. For the first time tonight, the adrenaline spiking through my veins began to settle, replaced by a cold, calculating clarity. Mr. Sterling adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses and slid a towering stack of legal documents across the polished wood. The heavy parchment paper bore the unmistakable gold foil seal of the Harrison estate. My grandfather was a man who believed in weight and substance, in things you could touch and verify. Grandad Harrison built his logistics empire from a single delivery truck in the brutal heat of the 1970s. Howe was a self-made titan who despised the country club elite and possessed an uncanny ability to spot a fraud from a mile away. It was no secret that he viewed his own son Desmond as his greatest disappointment. My father cared only about optics-tailored suits, expensive cars, and maintaining his status among Atlanta's black elite. Grandad Harrison used to tell me that Desmond was a man trying to build a castle on a foundation of sand. While my parents poured millions into Chantel grooming her to be the perfect trophy wife, Grandad pulled me aside. I spent countless Sunday afternoons locked in his dimly lit study, surrounded by the smell of aged leather and pipe tobacco. While Chantel was out crashing luxury cars, Grandad taught me how to read complex balance sheets. He showed me how to trace corporate shell companies, how to spot artificial inflation in asset valuations, and how to execute a hostile takeover without firing a single shot. He saw my quiet resilience and my absolute refusal to beg for Desmond's approval. "You have the mind of an architect, Zarya," he would tell me, his rough hands tapping a financial ledger. "Your father only knows how to spend, but you know how to build. Protect the foundation." Now, sitting across from Mr. Sterling, I understood the absolute magnitude of those Sunday lessons. "Your grandfather knew your father would attempt to contest any traditional will," Mr. Sterling said, his voice smooth and deeply serious. Desmond assumed that as the only son, the entire logistics empire and real estate portfolio would naturally default to him. He is currently operating under the delusion that probate is just temporarily tied up. He has absolutely no idea that your grandfather established a series of impenetrable blind trusts over 3 years ago, naming you as the sole irrevocable beneficiary. Mr. Sterling laid a solid gold pen on top of the first document. "By signing these transfer deeds, you will bypass probate entirely. The transition of power will be absolute. You will instantly assume total control of Harrison Logistics, the global real estate holdings, and the primary private equity firm. The total valuation of the assets is currently estimated at $2.5 billion. $2.5 billion. The number hung in the air, heavy and absolute. Just an hour ago, I was standing in the freezing snow, clutching a $20 bill my mother had tossed at me like I was a beggar. My sister had sneered at my single mother status, confident that she was the undeniable winner of our family dynamic. They thought they had discarded a burden. I picked up the pen. The metal was cool against my skin. I did not hesitate. I pressed the nib to the thick paper and signed my name. With that first stroke, I legally severed myself from the identity of the family scapegoat. I signed the second page, taking ownership of the international shipping fleet. I signed the third, transferring the commercial real estate deeds. With every signature, I shed the tired postpartum daughter who begged for shelter and stepped into the skin of an apex predator. The power shifted in the room, vibrating through my fingertips. I was no longer an outcast. I was a billionaire heiress, and I held the keys to the kingdom. "You are now the majority shareholder and chief executive officer of the Harrison estate," Mr. Sterling announced, his tone shifting from advisory to subordinate. He carefully gathered the signed documents, tapping the edges perfectly straight before locking them inside his briefcase. "Congratulations, Ms. Harrison. Your grandfather would be immensely proud of your composure tonight." I looked at my hands, expecting them to shake, but they were perfectly still. "Thank you, Mr. Sterling," I said, keeping my voice measured. "But we both know my grandfather did not bring me here tonight just to hand over the keys and let me sleep. There is a reason you had me extracted so quickly." A grim smile touched Mr. Sterling's lips. "You possess his exact instincts," he noted. He reached into the secondary compartment of his briefcase and pulled out a thick, highly classified dossier. Unlike the pristine legal documents, this folder was bound in blood-red leather. He placed it in the center of the desk, right where the trust papers had been. As the head of the estate, there is an immediate and critical financial matter that requires your direct authorization. Mr. Sterling continued, his demeanor turning razor-sharp. This dossier contains the shadow accounting books and forensic financial audits for Desmond's real estate holding company. It also includes the unredacted technical data and investor profiles for Connor's new app startup, the one they are currently hosting the Winter Gala for. I reached out and pulled the red folder toward me. My father had spent the last decade boasting about his commercial real estate acquisitions, acting like a titan of industry. Connor paraded around family dinners, talking about his disruptive algorithms and his elite angel investors. My parents worshipped Connor, treating him like the white knight who was going to elevate their social standing into the stratosphere. I flipped open the heavy cover of the dossier. The first page was a summary sheet of Desmond's corporate liabilities. The numbers were staggering. "Your father has been running a sophisticated shell game for the last 4 years," Mr. Sterling explained as my eyes scanned the columns of red ink. "He has overleveraged every single property in his portfolio. He took out massive high-interest bridge loans, using the family estate as collateral, fully anticipating that he would pay them off the moment your grandfather's inheritance cleared. He is currently operating on a severe deficit. His company is entirely insolvent." I turned the page, arriving at the section detailing Connor's startup. The deeper I read, the more my stomach twisted, not with anxiety, but with raw, unadulterated anger. Connor had convinced my father to act as his primary guarantor. Desmond had literally drained his company's remaining cash reserves to fund Connor's lavish operational expenses, his luxury leased vehicles, and the extravagant networking parties like the one happening at their mansion right now. But that was not the worst part. The technical audit conducted by my grandfather's elite cybersecurity team proved that Connor's revolutionary software was a complete sham. "Your brother-in-law has no proprietary code," Mr. Sterling stated matter-of-factly. "The application he is pitching to those investors tonight is built on stolen open-source frameworks. Furthermore, the user metrics he submitted to the venture capital firms are completely fabricated. It is not just a failed business, Zarya. It is active wire fraud. Your father and your brother-in-law are essentially running a criminal enterprise to maintain their country club lifestyle." I stared at the paperwork, the reality of their depravity sinking in. They threw me out into a blizzard because a crying baby would ruin the aesthetic of their fraudulent investor pitch. They were willing to risk my son's life to protect a scam. They despised me because I worked for an honest living while they built an entire existence on lies and stolen money. I looked up from the dossier, meeting Mr. Sterling's gaze. "The numbers here show massive overdue notes," I said, tapping the financial breakdown. "Desmond missed his last 3 balloon payments. Who holds the primary debt? Who exactly is the creditor that can pull the plug on this entire operation?" Mr. Sterling leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers together. "The primary creditor holding the note on your father's mansion and Connor's initial seed funding is a private equity firm called Apex Capital. It is a highly aggressive firm known for liquidating assets without mercy." "And let me guess," I said, a slow, dangerous smile creeping across my face. "Apex Capital is wholly owned by the Harrison Trust." Mr. Sterling nodded. "It is a subsidiary entirely under your direct control as of 5 minutes ago. You own their debt, Zarya. Every single dime. You are now their ultimate boss, their landlord, and their executioner. What are your orders?" I closed the red folder, the satisfying smack of the leather echoing in the quiet penthouse. I looked over at Trey, who was sleeping warmly and safely, completely untouched by the storm outside or the incoming hurricane I was about to unleash. My family wanted to play ruthless games. They wanted to worship status over blood. They were about to learn what real power looked like. Mr. Sterling and Elias left me alone in the penthouse shortly after midnight, with absolute assurance that the building's security was impenetrable. The silence of the top-floor suite was a stark contrast to the howling wind battering the reinforced glass windows. I walked down the long mahogany hallway to the state-of-the-art nursery that Elias had prepared. The room was bathed in the soft, warm glow of a nightlight. I stood over the plush bassinet, watching Trey sleep. His tiny chest rose and fell in a steady, comforting rhythm. His fists were unclenched, his breathing quiet and deep. Just hours ago, my father had forced this innocent child out into a lethal blizzard, simply because his crying might inconvenience a room full of arrogant strangers. I gently adjusted the cashmere blanket over Trey, making a silent vow. He would never know the coldness of conditional love. He would never be treated as a burden or a scapegoat. I would burn the old world down to ensure his foundation was built on solid bedrock. I walked back into the expansive living room and headed straight for the massive dining table. I poured myself a cup of black coffee from the kitchen carafe, letting the bitter heat sharpen my focus. I untied the red leather band of the dossier Mr. Sterling had left behind and spread the documents across the polished glass surface. This was not just a folder of financial statements. It was a forensic autopsy of a dying dynasty. For my entire life, Desmond and Yvonne had paraded around Atlanta as the pinnacle of black excellence. They demanded respect, they flaunted their country club memberships, and they looked down on anyone who dared to build wealth slowly and honestly. They told me my career in financial technology was unglamorous and masculine, completely missing the fact that my exact skill set was about to be their undoing. I opened the first ledger, focusing on Desmond's primary real estate holding company. Grandad Harrison had built that company by acquiring commercial warehouses and logistics hubs, securing steady generational income. Desmond took over and immediately tried to pivot into luxury commercial high-rises, eager to see his name in bright lights. As my eyes scanned the columns of red ink, the staggering incompetence of my father became undeniable. I had over-leveraged every single property in the portfolio. He took out massive high-interest bridge loans to acquire buildings he could not afford to maintain. When the commercial real estate market dipped and tenants began breaking their leases, Desmond did not downsize. Instead, he took out secondary loans against the family estate, pulling equity out of the very mansion he had just kicked me out of. The facade was sickening. Desmond was missing balloon payments right and left. He had created a tangled web of shell companies, trying to move liabilities off his primary balance sheet to trick his creditors. He was robbing Peter to pay Paul, bleeding his own legacy dry, just to keep up appearances. The caterers, the private helicopter arrivals, the vintage champagne flowing at their winter gala. Right now, it was all being paid for with borrowed money they had absolutely no way of returning. They were drowning in toxic debt and acting like royalty on a sinking ship. I pushed Desmond's miserable ledgers aside and pulled up the secondary audit. This section contained the unredacted technical data and investor profiles for Connor's new application startup. Connor was the golden son-in-law, the brilliant tech visionary that my parents treated like a deity. Chantel constantly bragged about his genius, claiming his app was going to revolutionize social networking and make them billionaires. My parents worshipped the ground he walked on, believing his white privilege and smooth-talking pitches guaranteed their financial salvation. I read the cybersecurity report prepared by my grandfather's elite tech team, and a cold, hard laugh escaped my lips. Connor was not a genius. He was a spectacular, arrogant fraud. The proprietary algorithm he had been pitching to venture capitalists all evening was entirely fake. The source code was ripped directly from an open-source framework on GitHub, completely stripped of its original licensing and slapped with a slick, minimalist user interface. There was zero underlying innovation. But the technical theft was only the beginning of the scam. I dug into the user acquisition metrics. Connor claimed to have a massive, highly engaged daily active user base, generating millions of interactions to prove market viability. The forensic audit completely dismantled this lie. Over 80% of Connor's user base consisted of sophisticated bot farms purchased through offshore accounts in Eastern Europe. The engagement was artificial. The growth trajectory was fabricated. Connor had doctored the analytics dashboards before presenting them to the angel investors, effectively committing massive-scale wire fraud. I was walking around my parents' mansion right now, clinking glasses with billionaires peddling a worthless empty shell. But the most damning revelation was the money trail connecting the two men. I cross-referenced the bank routing numbers from Desmond's company to Connor's operational accounts. My stomach tightened in pure disgust. Desmond had been secretly funneling his company's remaining cash reserves directly into Connor's startup. He was generating fake revenue streams for the app to make it look profitable to outside investors. My father had literally drained the last surviving assets of Grandad Harrison's hard-earned empire to finance the lavish lifestyle of a con artist. Chantel's designer wardrobe, her constant international vacations, her luxury vehicles, all of it was funded by stolen money and fraudulent investor capital. They despised me because I worked for an honest living. They called me a failure because I refused to participate in their shallow performative existence. All the while they were running a criminal enterprise from the comfort of their grand parlor. If the investors attending their little winter mixer knew the truth, they would not just pull their funding. They would contact the federal authorities before the night was over. I reached the final section of the dossier, the exact terms of the debt covenants held by Apex Capital. As Mr. Sterling had informed me, Apex Capital was a private equity firm wholly owned by the Harrison Trust, which meant I was now the sole owner of the firm. I traced my finger down the dense legal text, reading the specific stipulations Desmond and Connor had agreed to when they blindly signed for their bailout loans. In his sheer desperation to maintain his wealthy image, Desmond had signed away every ounce of his leverage. The covenants included a strict acceleration clause. If any material fraud, misrepresentation, or financial insolvency was discovered by the creditor, the entirety of the debt became immediately due and payable. There was no grace period. There was no negotiation phase. The moment the creditor invoked the clause, all collateral, including the commercial properties, the business accounts, and the family estate itself would be instantly seized. Furthermore, Connor had signed a personal guarantee backed by Desmond's assets, meaning they were legally chained together in this sinking vessel. If one went down, the other was dragged into the abyss with him. They had willingly handed over the keys to their entire existence to a faceless private equity firm, assuming they could just charm their way out of the debt when the time came. They had no idea that the faceless firm now had my face. I sat back in the leather dining chair, the sheer magnitude of my leverage washing over me. Tomorrow morning my mother would wake up believing she had successfully discarded her greatest embarrassment. Chantel would wake up believing she was the wealthy, untouchable wife of a tech titan. Desmond would wake up believing he had secured the final round of funding to save his crumbling empire. They were all living on borrowed time. I closed the red leather dossier, the heavy sound echoing through the quiet penthouse. I did not just have the power to cut off their allowance. I had the legal authority to obliterate their entire reality. I owned their debt, I owned their home, and I owned the literal ground they walked on. I walked over to the floor-to-ceiling windows, looking out at the brutal storm still raging across the dark city. The cold did not bother me anymore. I was the storm now. Morning broke over Atlanta, painting the frozen city in a harsh, blinding light. The historic blizzard had finally moved on, leaving behind a thick layer of ice that paralyzed the streets below my top-floor penthouse. Inside the climate-controlled nursery, Trey woke up with a soft coo, perfectly warm and completely safe. I lifted my son from his plush bassinet, resting him against my shoulder as I walked out into the expansive living room. The quiet peace of the morning was shattered by a sharp, aggressive buzz from my phone resting on the marble kitchen island. I picked it up, half expecting another unhinged text message from my sister Chantel. Instead, the screen displayed a high-priority security alert from my old personal bank. The notification stated that my checking account, the modest account where I kept my consulting salary and grocery money, had been entirely frozen pending a criminal investigation. My brow furrowed. I opened the secure message center and read the official bank correspondence. The breath hitched in my throat, not from fear, but from the sheer audacity of the betrayal. My mother Yvonne had contacted the fraud department at dawn. She filed an official report claiming that I had stolen several pieces of priceless family heirloom jewelry, including her grandmother's diamond brooch, on my way out of the estate last night. She instructed the bank to freeze my assets to ensure I could not liquidate the supposedly stolen goods and flee the state. Yvonne was not satisfied with simply throwing her daughter and newborn grandson into a lethal winter storm. She wanted to make absolutely certain that I was completely destitute, unable to buy a single can of baby formula or pay for a cheap motel room. She wanted me to freeze to death while carrying the label of a common thief. It was a calculated, venomous strike designed to force me to crawl back to their doorstep and beg for mercy on my knees. Yesterday, that notification would have sent me into a blind panic. I would have spent hours on hold crying to customer service representatives, desperately trying to prove my innocence while my child went hungry. Today, I just smiled. I set Trey down in his automated smart swing, letting the gentle motion soothe him. I pulled out the sleek black business card Mr. Sterling had given me the night before. It bore a single direct dial number to the Apex Tier Wealth Management Division of the bank that oversaw the Harrison Trust. I dialed the number. It did not even ring fully before a crisp, attentive voice answered on the other end, addressing me by name. I explained the situation regarding my personal checking account and the fraudulent theft claim filed by my mother. The private banker sounded genuinely amused by the absurdity of the situation. "Ms. Harrison, please accept my apologies for the automated alert," he said, his tone entirely deferential. "Your personal checking account was integrated into the Harrison Trust umbrella at 3 in the morning. Our system simply generated a standard notification before the wealth management overrides took effect. The freeze has already been completely dissolved. Furthermore, considering you now own a controlling stake in the financial institution holding the jewelry insurance policy, we find the accusation of theft highly irregular. Would you like us to dismiss your mother's claim, or would you prefer to take a more aggressive stance against the fraudulent report?" I looked out the window at the frozen city, thinking about my father Desmond and his desperate attempts to maintain his wealthy facade. Tonight was their highly anticipated winter gala at the country club. The event was supposed to be the crowning achievement of their social season, an extravagant networking party designed to secure millions in angel investments for Connor's fraudulent tech startup. Desmond had drained his corporate accounts to fund the party, but I knew how these high society events operated. The country club required final payment for the catering, the premium open bar, the valet services, and the event staff on the morning of the event before a single guest was allowed through the doors. "I want to take a highly aggressive stance," I instructed, my voice steady and cold. "My mother filed a false police report and attempted to weaponize this bank against a high-net-worth client. I want you to initiate a comprehensive fraud investigation into her claim. And since she shares joint accounts with my father Desmond, I want all of their personal and corporate liquidity locked down immediately. Flag their entire portfolio for suspicious activity. Do not allow a single transaction to clear until the investigation is concluded." "Consider it done," Ms. Harrison the banker replied smoothly, without a second of hesitation. "Their assets will be entirely inaccessible within the next 3 minutes. We take fraud against our primary shareholders incredibly seriously." I ended the call and walked over to the kitchen, brewing a fresh cup of coffee. The aroma filled the room, grounding me in the reality of my new power. For 32 years, my parents had used their wealth as a weapon to control me, to belittle my accomplishments, and to elevate Chantel into a false idol. They loved the power that money gave them over other people. Now I was going to show them what happened when the weapon was turned in the other direction. Less than 45 minutes later, my phone began to light up like a distress beacon. Desmond was calling. I watched his name flash across the screen, letting it ring until it went to voicemail. He called again, then a third time. Then a text message came through entirely in capitalized letters demanding. I pick up the phone immediately. I took a slow sip of my dark roast coffee, enjoying the absolute silence of my penthouse. Finally, my phone chimed, indicating a new voicemail had been deposited. I tapped the screen and put the message on speakerphone. Desmond's voice blasted through the quiet room, thick with panic and barely suppressed rage. "Zaria, you need to answer your phone right now," he shouted, the background noise indicating he was standing in the middle of a chaotic room. "I do not know what kind of stunt you pulled, but the bank is telling me our accounts are locked because of some investigation linked to you. The country club manager is standing right in front of me, threatening to cancel the entire winter gala. The caterers are refusing to unload the Wagyu beef, and the ice sculpture delivery team is threatening to drive away if their final invoices do not clear in the next 10 minutes. Call the bank and fix whatever glitch you caused right now. We have billionaires arriving tonight, and if Connor does not get this funding, we are all ruined. Call me back immediately. The voicemail clicked off. I stood in my kitchen marveling at the sheer delusion of the man. He had kicked his daughter and newborn grandson into a blizzard less than 12 hours ago. Yet his primary concern, his absolute singular focus, was that his ice sculptures were melting in the delivery truck because his credit cards were declining. He still believed he could bark orders at me. He still thought I was the obedient scapegoat who would scramble to fix his problems just to earn a crumb of his affection. He truly believed this was just a banking glitch and not the deliberate execution of his financial demise. I deleted the voicemail with a single swipe of my finger. I had no intention of fixing his glitch. The caterers could leave, the florists could pack up their imported orchids. Desmond and Chantel could stand in an empty ballroom and try to pitch their fraudulent app to investors using nothing but their inflated egos. But I knew Desmond would scramble. He would likely leverage his last remaining social connections, begging for an emergency short-term loan just to get the doors open tonight. He would do whatever it took to keep the illusion alive for one more evening. He was setting up the perfect stage for his own public destruction. I picked up the phone and dialed Mr. Sterling. The attorney answered instantly, his tone sharp and ready for action. "Good morning, Ms. Harrison," Mr. Sterling said. "I assume you have reviewed the red dossier." "I have reviewed every single page," I replied, walking back into the living room and staring at the stacks of financial evidence. Desmond is completely insolvent, and Connor's startup is an active criminal enterprise built on wire fraud and stolen code. They are currently panicking because I just had the bank freeze their remaining liquid assets under a fraud investigation. Desmond is desperate. He is going to try to push this investor gala through tonight no matter the cost. Mr. Sterling chuckled softly, a dry sound that carried immense authority. He is a man walking on a tightrope made of tissue paper. What are your instructions? It is time to pull the net closed, I said, my voice dropping into a register I had never used before. I want you to contact Apex Capital immediately. Execute the aggressive buyout of all their remaining corporate debt. Consolidate every single loan, every mortgage, and every line of credit under my direct authority. I want to own the paper on his mansion, his commercial properties, and Connor's fraudulent seed funding before the sun sets today. Once you have secured the debt, prepare the acceleration clauses for immediate activation. It will be my absolute pleasure, Ms. Harrison, Mr. Sterling replied, the sound of keyboard clacking already audible in the background. The buyout will be finalized within the hour. By the time they open the doors for their little winter wonderland gala tonight, you will be their sole creditor. Excellent, I said. Have my security detail assembled and prepare the forensic audit files. I am going to need a very specific dress for tonight. I am going to crash a party. I turned away from the glass windows and walked back to the massive dining table where the red leather dossier still lay open. The morning light cast long, sharp shadows across the financial documents that dictated my family's impending ruin. Mr. Sterling had not left the penthouse. He was working in the adjacent executive study, communicating on a secure line with the senior partners at Apex Capital. I walked to the doorway and signaled for him to join me. The time for observation had officially ended. It was time to tighten the noose. Mr. Sterling stepped into the room, his tablet in hand. I pointed directly to the itemized list of Desmond's outstanding liabilities. I do not just want to monitor these loans, I told him, my voice echoing with absolute authority. I want to own them completely. I want you to initiate an aggressive hostile buyout of all their remaining corporate debt. Target the specific mezzanine debt packages that hold Desmond's Atlanta estate and his commercial properties as direct collateral. I want the promissory notes in my name before noon. Mr. Sterling tapped his screen, his eyes gleaming with professional satisfaction. The secondary debt markets are highly volatile today due to the storm, but with the liquidity of the Harrison Trust, we can bypass standard negotiations and purchase the debt at a premium from the current note holders. They will gladly offload Desmond's toxic liabilities for an immediate cash settlement. I will instruct the acquisitions team at Apex to execute the transfer immediately. For the next 2 hours, the penthouse became a war room. I sat beside Mr. Sterling, reviewing digital contracts as they flooded into our secure server. I watched the intricate legal machinery of my grandfather's empire go to work. Desmond had been incredibly foolish. In his desperation to fund Connor's fraudulent startup and maintain his high society image, he had cross-collateralized everything. I used the deed to the family mansion, the very house I grew up in, to secure a massive high-interest commercial loan. He assumed his social standing made him invincible. He had no idea how the real world operated. By 11 in the morning, the final confirmation chimes echoed from Mr. Sterling's tablet. The deed of trust for the Atlanta estate was now legally held by Apex Capital. The bridge loans keeping Connor's tech company afloat were fully transferred to my subsidiary. I traced my finger over the digital signature on the screen. The same hand that had thrown my newborn son into a freezing blizzard had blindly signed away his entire kingdom. I was no longer the disappointing daughter who failed to secure a wealthy husband. I was officially their boss. I was their landlord. I was their executioner. As we finalized the asset transfers, my private line rang. It was Malik, the managing director of intelligence and acquisitions at Apex Capital. I put the call on speakerphone, leaning back in my chair. Ms. Harrison Malik began, his tone clipped and efficient. We have fully secured the debt portfolio as requested. We are also actively monitoring Desmond and Connor's financial movements following your banking freeze this morning. The situation on their end is escalating rapidly. Give me the exact damage report, I commanded. Desmond has been scrambling for the past 3 hours, Malik reported. Because you locked down his primary liquidity, he could not pay the final vendor invoices for the winter gala tonight. According to our surveillance, his wife Yvonne actually had to visit a high-end pawnbroker in Buckhead. She leveraged her diamond tennis bracelet and 2 designer handbags for a predatory short-term cash loan just to pay the country club caterers and the valet service. They are desperate to get the doors open tonight. A cold laugh escaped my throat. My mother, who prided herself on looking down at anyone she deemed financially inferior, was pawning her jewelry in the snow just to keep up appearances. It was a pathetic display of vanity, but it told me exactly what I needed to know. They were cornered animals. Why are they fighting so hard for this specific party, I asked. They could have canceled due to the weather. Because tonight is their absolute last chance at survival, Malik explained. We intercepted communications between Connor and 3 major angel investors from Silicon Valley. Those investors managed to fly into Atlanta before the storm hit. Connor is pitching his application to them tonight at the Buckhead Elite Country Club. He is asking for a $20 million seed round. Desmond is banking his entire commercial real estate portfolio on Connor securing those funds tonight. If Connor gets those signatures, Desmond plans to use the investor capital to pay off the overdue loans you now hold. The audacity was breathtaking. They were planning to defraud Silicon Valley investors with stolen code and fabricated user metrics just to pay off their personal debts. Chantel and Connor were playing a dangerous game of corporate roulette, and Desmond was enabling the entire scam. They are hosting a Winter Wonderland gala at the country club tonight to trap these investors. Malik continued. Chantel has been posting on social media all morning, completely oblivious to the fact that her parents are pawning jewelry to pay for the ice sculptures. They have rented the grand ballroom. The guest list includes the wealthiest elites in the city. They are trying to manufacture an illusion of ultimate success to blind the investors to the truth. I looked over at Mr. Sterling. The puzzle pieces had aligned perfectly. Desmond and Connor wanted a public stage to secure their salvation. They wanted to stand in front of Atlanta high society and pretend they were untouchable titans of industry. I was going to give them a public stage, but the performance would be entirely mine. Malik, I said, my voice dropping into a deadly calm register. I want you to assemble the primary asset recovery team from Apex. Pull your best forensic accountants and your most ruthless corporate liquidators. Consider it done, Ms. Harrison, Malik replied. Where are we deploying them? Tell them to put on their best black tie attire, I instructed. We are going to the Buckhead Elite Country Club. We are going to conduct a real-time forensic audit right in the middle of their grand ballroom. I ended the call and stood up from the table. The exhaustion from the past 24 hours was completely gone, replaced by a surging electric energy. I walked down the hall to the nursery. Elias had arranged for a highly credentialed elite night nurse to arrive discreetly through the private elevator. She was a warm, capable woman who immediately understood the requirement for absolute privacy and security. I kissed Trey gently on his forehead, watching him sleep safely in his warm, pristine environment. He would never have to beg for a place at a table. He owned the table. I walked into the master suite and opened the expansive walk-in closet. I needed to shed the image of the tired postpartum single mother that my family loved to mock. I needed armor. I selected a custom-tailored emerald green silk gown that draped flawlessly against my dark skin. The color was deliberate. It was the exact shade Chantel had worn the night before when she stood in the foyer and told me a crying baby would ruin her aesthetic. I paired the gown with simple, elegant diamond studs, avoiding the flashy, gaudy accessories my mother always favored. True power did not need to shout. True power whispered. I sat at the vanity applying my makeup with slow, deliberate precision. I traced the line of my jaw, staring into my own eyes in the mirror. I thought about the decades of emotional abuse, the constant comparisons to Chantel, the way my father dismissed my hard-earned career simply because it did not look glamorous on a country club brochure. They thought they had successfully pushed me out of their narrative. They thought they had closed the door on my existence. I stood up, smoothing the emerald silk over my hips. I picked up the blood-red leather dossier containing their financial execution and walked back out into the living room. Mr. Sterling was waiting by the door, his briefcase in hand, his suit immaculate. Downstairs in the secure garage, Elias had the Maybach running, and a convoy of black SUVs filled with Apex Capital liquidators was already lining up behind him. It was time to get dressed for a party I was not invited to. I stood before the floor-to-ceiling mirror in the master suite and let the transformation settle over me. The emerald green silk hugged my curves with absolute precision, moving like liquid glass when I took a breath. The color was highly deliberate. It was the exact shade Chantel had worn the night before when she stood in the foyer and told me a crying baby would ruin her aesthetic. Just 24 hours ago, I was shivering in an oversized maternity sweater, clutching a diaper bag while my own blood relatives threw me into a deadly winter storm. They had looked at my postpartum exhaustion and seen weakness. They saw a single mother with no husband and no immediate value to their high society masquerade. But the woman reflecting back at me now was completely unrecognizable to the scapegoat they thought they had discarded. My dark hair was pulled back into a sleek, flawless chignon, drawing full attention to the sharp angles of my face and the diamond studs resting at my ears. I did not look like a struggling consultant begging for a guest room. I looked exactly like what I was, the wealthiest woman in the entire state of Georgia. I walked back to the center of the living room, where the blood-red leather dossier sat waiting on the glass dining table. I opened it one last time, verifying the execution of the financial traps my team had laid. The foreclosure notices for Desmond's commercial properties and his sprawling estate were stamped and legally binding. The forensic cybersecurity audits detailing Connor's massive wire fraud were neatly tabbed and highlighted. I carefully aligned the thick stack of papers, ensuring the bankruptcy filings sat right on top. I snapped the red leather cover shut. It felt heavy in my hands, carrying the exact weight of my family's impending destruction. Mr. Sterling entered the room flanked by Elias and two heavily armed members of my new private security detail. The attorney's sharp eyes took in my appearance and a rare, genuine smile crossed his face. He checked his luxury wristwatch and gave a curt nod of approval. "The trap is completely set, Ms. Harrison," Mr. Sterling stated, his voice thrumming with quiet anticipation. "Malik and the corporate liquidation team are already positioned outside the venue perimeters." Desmond managed to secure an exorbitant short-term loan from a predatory underground lender just to pay the country club management this afternoon. He literally mortgaged the last remaining equity of his personal luxury vehicles just to get the doors open tonight. He is currently pitching to the Silicon Valley investors, acting as if he still controls a massive empire. "He controls absolutely nothing," I replied, my voice cold and steady. Let us go remind him who holds the deed to his life. We took the private elevator down to the secure underground garage. The air was thick with the low hum of heavily armored engines. A convoy of 3 jet-black SUVs waited in absolute formation. Elias opened the rear door of the customized Maybach, and I slid into the heated leather seat, placing the red dossier firmly on my lap. Mr. Sterling took the seat opposite me, while the security detail filed into the lead and trailing vehicles. The heavy steel garage doors rolled upward, and our motorcade surged out into the freezing Atlanta night. The streets were treacherous, coated in a thick layer of solid ice that kept the general public trapped inside their homes. But my vehicles were equipped for the brutal conditions gripping the asphalt with unyielding force. I stared out the tinted window watching the dark frozen city blur past. My mind drifted to the Buckhead Elite Country Club, our destination for the evening. That country club had always been a supreme symbol of my exclusion. When Chantel turned 16, Desmond bought her a premium junior membership, throwing a lavish party on the club's private golf course. When I asked if I could join them for the Sunday networking brunches to help build my early financial consulting contacts, my mother Yvonne had scoffed in my face. She looked me up and down and told me I was entirely too masculine and unrefined for their social circles. She said my presence would only embarrass Chantel and ruin Desmond's chances of securing wealthy clients. Years later, when Connor entered the picture, the dynamic only grew worse. Connor loved to invite my parents to the country club for expensive dinners to brag about his non-existent coding skills. On the rare occasion I was forced to attend for a family holiday, Connor would loudly mock my job. He would tell the waiters that I was just a boring corporate drone pushing spreadsheets while he was out disrupting the tech industry. They kept that wealthy elite world locked away from me, using it as a fortress to protect their golden child and her fraudulent husband. Tonight I was not asking for an invitation. I was bringing a battering ram. The motorcade turned off the main highway and approached the long, winding driveway of the Buckhead Elite Country Club. The venue was a massive, sprawling mansion of white columns and glowing amber lights, standing in stark defiance of the winter storm raging around it. The driveway was packed with luxury vehicles. Valets in thick winter coats were sprinting back and forth, desperately trying to keep up with the influx of wealthy guests. Elias did not slow down to join the back of the valet queue. He bypassed the line entirely, steering the massive Maybach directly up to the front entrance and blocking the primary drop-off zone. The trailing SUVs pulled up sharply behind us, boxing out a silver Bentley attempting to leave. A flustered valet rushed forward, waving his hands and shouting that the zone was restricted for VIP arrivals only. One of my security operatives stepped out of the lead vehicle, flashing a metallic badge that made the valet instantly step back and lower his head in submission. I did not wait for Elias to open my door. I pushed it open myself and stepped out into the freezing night air. The bitter cold hit my bare shoulders, but the adrenaline coursing through my veins burned far hotter. I stood on the pristine cobblestone driveway, flanked by towering stone columns, holding the blood-red dossier tightly against my side. Through the massive floor-to-ceiling glass doors of the grand ballroom, I could see the event in full swing. It was a sickening display of artificial opulence. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm golden glow over hundreds of guests dressed in their finest winter formal wear. Waiters carried silver trays loaded with vintage champagne and expensive hors d'oeuvres. Giant, meticulously carved ice sculptures adorned the centerpieces, funded entirely by the jewelry my mother had pawned just hours ago. And right in the center of the room, basking in the artificial spotlight, was Chantel. My sister looked radiant, playing the perfect supportive wife to her scam artist husband. She was wearing a sparkling silver gown, laughing loudly, and touching the arm of an older white man who looked exactly like the Silicon Valley angel investors Connor had been desperately hunting. Connor stood beside her, gesturing wildly with his hands, performing his pitch with the smooth, practiced ease of a career con man. They looked so incredibly smug. They looked like people who believed they had officially won the game. They thought I was currently shivering in a downtown homeless shelter, desperately trying to keep my newborn son alive. They thought they had successfully erased me from their perfect narrative forever. I took a deep breath, letting the freezing air fill my lungs. Mr. Sterling stepped up to my right, and my lead security operative fell into step on my left. I did not break eye contact with the glass doors. I gripped the red folder ready to unleash absolute financial devastation. I walked forward, the heels of my shoes clicking sharply against the frozen stone, marching straight toward the entrance of a party I was never supposed to attend. The heavy glass doors of the country club slid open, yielding to the sheer force of my arrival. The sudden blast of warm air from the grand ballroom hit my face, carrying the heavy scent of expensive perfume, roasted winter vegetables, and vintage champagne. I did not pause at the reception desk. The two hostesses holding the leather-bound guest lists looked up in shock as my security team smoothly stepped past the velvet ropes, clearing a wide path for me. Mr. Sterling walked a half step behind my right shoulder, radiating the kind of lethal corporate authority that made the country club staff immediately step back in submission. Elias flanked my left side, his eyes scanning the crowded room for any sudden movements. The ballroom was an absolute masterpiece of financial deception. Towering ice sculptures carved into the shapes of swans and abstract technology logos anchored the massive buffet tables. I knew for an absolute fact that my mother had pawned her diamond tennis bracelet just to keep those exact sculptures from melting in a delivery truck this morning. The room was packed wall to wall with the wealthiest figures in Atlanta, mingling effortlessly with the Silicon Valley venture capitalists Connor had lured into his trap. The sound of clinking crystal glasses and arrogant laughter filled the expansive space. It was the perfect stage for a slaughter, and my family had decorated it themselves. I scanned the room and found my target almost immediately. Chantel was holding court near the center ice sculpture. She was laughing a little too loudly, tossing her head back and lightly touching the forearm of a distinguished-looking older white investor. She wore that same silver designer gown, paid for with money my father had illegally siphoned from his failing real estate company. For a brief second, I remembered standing in the freezing foyer just last night, holding my newborn son against my chest, while she mocked my exhaustion and told me I was ruining her aesthetic. She thought she had won. She thought the game was completely over. Then her eyes locked onto mine across the crowded floor. The transformation was instantaneous and beautiful to witness. Her fake, brilliant smile vanished, completely replaced by a mask of absolute horror. She blinked rapidly, as if she could not comprehend what she was seeing. I was not wearing my tired maternity clothes. I was not slouching in defeat or begging for a quiet corner to rest. I stood tall, draped in custom emerald silk, flanked by men who looked ready to dismantle the building brick by brick. My presence commanded the immediate attention of the room. The subtle shift in energy was palpable as the Atlanta elite sensed a disruption in the natural order of their exclusive gathering. Chantel whispered something to the investor, abruptly excusing herself. I watched her shoulders tense as she marched toward me, her silver heels clicking aggressively against the polished hardwood floor. She was gearing up for a fight, relying on the only defensive tactic she had ever known: public humiliation. For 32 years, my sister had used her status as the golden child to keep me down. She had always performed for an audience, knowing our parents would back up whatever cruel insult she hurled my way. She assumed tonight would be no different. She closed the distance between us, stopping just outside the reach of my security detail. She looked me up and down, her eyes darting to the diamond studs in my ears and the flawless cut of my gown. I could see the pure venom brewing in her chest, battling with a rising tide of confusion. She assumed I had crashed the party to beg for money or to cause a desperate dramatic scene out of sheer jealousy. She wanted to establish her dominance immediately. She wanted everyone in her immediate vicinity to know that she was the superior sister dealing with a deranged and unstable relative. "Did you leave your fatherless baby in the coat check?" Chantel sneered, her voice dripping with poison. She intentionally pitched her voice loud enough for the nearby circle of elite investors to hear. Several heads turned in our direction, conversations pausing as the wealthy attendees tuned in for the unexpected drama. "You are not on the guest list, Zaria. You have no business being here. Leave right now before you embarrass us and ruin Connor's pitch." The cruelty of bringing my newborn son into her public attack was breathtaking, but entirely expected. Yesterday, a comment like that would have sent a sharp, agonizing pain straight through my heart. I would have lowered my eyes, felt the sting of tears, and retreated in shame just to keep the peace. I would have internalized the insult and believed that I was exactly the failure she claimed I was. But today her words held absolutely no power over me. They just sounded hollow, pathetic, and incredibly desperate. I did not raise my voice. I did not shrink back or act defensive. I stood perfectly still, allowing the silence between us to stretch for 3 long, agonizing seconds. The investors watching us leaned in, slightly captivated by the absolute lack of fear in my posture. I let the weight of the moment press down on her. I looked at the silver fabric of her dress. I thought about the forensic accounting files locked safely inside the red leather folder I was holding against my side. That dress was bought with stolen funds. The champagne she had been drinking was purchased on fraudulent credit. The very ground she stood on was mortgaged to the absolute hilt and held by my private equity firm. She was a fragile paper doll playing in a collapsing house of cards. "You need to turn around and walk out those doors before I call security." Chantal continued, her voice trembling just a fraction as my silence began to unnerve her. "You are sick, Zarya. You are having a postpartum breakdown and you are taking it out on my husband. Connor is about to close a $20 million deal tonight and I will not let your petty jealousy destroy my life. Get out of my sight." She took a step closer, pointing a manicured finger at my chest, attempting to invade my space. Elias stepped forward instantly, his massive frame blocking her path. Chantal gasped and stumbled back, nearly dropping her champagne flute. She looked up at my security operative, her eyes wide with sudden realization that I had not come alone and I had not come to play games. The whisper network in the ballroom was already activating. Guests were murmuring to one another, pointing at the heavy security presence and the stark contrast between my calm demeanor and Chantal's escalating panic. I looked Chantal up and down, taking in her entire fraudulent existence. My gaze was so cold and dissecting that she actually shifted her weight nervously, crossing her arms over her chest, as if to protect herself from the incoming strike. I thought about my son Trey sleeping warmly in a penthouse bought and paid for by a legacy she would never have access to. I thought about my grandfather who had seen right through this exact superficial nonsense. "I do not need to be on the guest list for a building my trust just purchased this afternoon," I replied, my voice completely calm and cutting through the ambient noise of the ballroom like a polished blade. Chantal stared at me, her perfectly glossed lips parted in a silent gasp. For a fleeting second, her brain tried to process the words I had just spoken, but her deeply ingrained superiority complex violently rejected the information. She let out a sharp, condescending laugh, throwing her head back to make sure the nearby venture capitalists saw how unbothered she was by my presence. "You are completely delusional," Zarya Chantal said, her voice shaking slightly despite her attempt at a mocking tone. "You do not even own a home, let alone a country club. Stop embarrassing yourself and get out of here before Dad sees you." But it was already too late. The subtle ripple of tension spreading through the grand ballroom had caught my father's attention. I watched Desmond push his way through the crowd of elite Atlanta socialites. His jaw was clenched so tight the muscles twitched beneath his skin. I was a man who worshipped optics, who demanded absolute submission from his family to maintain his fragile image of patriarchal authority. Seeing the daughter he had literally discarded into a blizzard, now standing in the center of his crucial networking event, flanked by private security, was a direct threat to his entire existence. "What in the hell is going on here?" Desmond demanded, his voice a low, dangerous rumble as he stepped between me and Chantal. He looked me up and down, taking in the custom emerald silk and the diamond studs. But his mind refused to update the narrative he had written for me. He still saw the tired, pregnant failure he had kicked out 24 hours ago. "I explicitly told you that you were no longer welcome in my presence, Zarya." Before I could respond, Connor casually strolled over, joining the confrontation with his hands tucked loosely into the pockets of his expensive tailored trousers. He held his whiskey glass, projecting an aura of completely unbothered white male privilege. He turned to his lead investors, offering them an apologetic, sympathetic smile. "Gentlemen, I am so sorry for this interruption," Connor said, his tone dripping with fake compassion. "This is my sister-in-law. She unfortunately just gave birth out of wedlock a few days ago. The poor thing is severely struggling with a postpartum delusion. The hormones are making her hysterical, and she is prone to these frantic, unpredictable episodes. Please excuse the disturbance. We will have her safely escorted back to a medical facility immediately. The sheer venom hidden beneath his polite corporate concern made my blood run cold. Connor was using the oldest, most insidious weapon available. He was weaponizing a black woman's mental health to instantly discredit my reality and protect his fraudulent empire. He wanted the investors to view me as a tragic, unstable burden, rather than an apex predator holding the keys to their financial execution. The investors murmured among themselves, casting me looks of deep, uncomfortable pity. They were buying his performance completely. Desmond eagerly seized on Connor's narrative, turning toward the nearest event staff member. He snapped his fingers aggressively in the air, a gesture of ultimate disrespect. "Security!" He barked loud enough for the entire section of the ballroom to hear. "Get the country club security over here right now. We have a trespassing situation with an unstable individual." The atmosphere in the room shifted from uncomfortable curiosity to active hostility. Two burly security guards in dark blazers pushed their way through the crowd of onlookers. They were massive men hired specifically to keep the uninvited away from the wealthy elite of Buckhead. Desmond pointed a rigid finger at my chest, his face flushed dark with rage. "Grab her and throw her out the service entrance," Desmond ordered the guards. "Do not let her cause another scene in front of my guests." The two guards stepped forward, reaching their hands out to grab my bare shoulders. They did not even make it within 3 feet of me. Elias moved with a terrifying silent speed. My lead security operative stepped directly into the path of the approaching guards, his massive frame creating an impenetrable wall of tailored muscle between me and the country club staff. The two other operatives from my private detail immediately flanked my sides, forming a rigid defensive perimeter. Elias did not draw a weapon or raise his voice. He simply locked eyes with the country club guards and slightly shifted his stance. The sheer professional lethality radiating from my team made the two club bouncers freeze dead in their tracks. They realized instantly that they were completely out of their depth. This was not a distressed single mother wandering into a party. This was a highly coordinated executive protection detail. "What are you idiots doing?" Desmond screamed, his composure finally shattering as the investors watched the standoff unfold. "I pay a fortune in membership dues to this club. Arrest her right now, or I will have both of your jobs by tomorrow morning." A sharp, authoritative voice cut through Desmond's screaming. "Stand down right now." The head of the country club's security, a stern older man named Jenkins, marched quickly across the ballroom floor. Jenkins was a fixture at the club, a man Desmond frequently slipped $100 bills to in order to secure preferential parking and VIP tables. Desmond smiled triumphantly as Jenkins approached, fully expecting the head of security to physically drag me out of the building to protect his favorite paying member. "Jenkins, get this woman out of my sight," Desmond commanded, crossing his arms over his chest. "She is trespassing and harassing my investors." But Jenkins did not look at Desmond. He had his hand pressed firmly against the earpiece in his right ear, listening intently to an emergency communication coming directly from the country club's board of directors. The color began to rapidly drain from Jenkins' face. He swallowed hard, his eyes darting from the elite Apex Capital operatives surrounding me to the calm, unboding expression on my face. The message playing in his earpiece was confirming the absolute reality of my earlier statement. The massive private equity firm Apex Capital had just executed a hostile takeover of the country club's parent company an hour ago. The building, the grounds, the staff, and the very floor we were standing on had been legally transferred to the Harrison Trust. Jenkins lowered his hand from his ear. He bypassed Desmond entirely, stepping around my furious father as if he were nothing more than an invisible obstacle. Jenkins stopped exactly 2 feet in front of me, keeping a respectful distance from Elias. To the absolute horror and confusion of my family, Jenkins lowered his head and bowed deeply to me. "Ms. Harrison," Jenkins said, his voice carrying clearly over the dead silence of the ballroom. "I deeply apologize for the extreme disrespect shown by my staff. We were not informed by upper management that you would be personally inspecting the property this evening. The entire club is completely at your disposal. Please let me know how I can be of immediate service to you." The power dynamic in the room abruptly and violently fractured. The collective gasp from the surrounding elite guests sounded like all the oxygen being sucked out of the ballroom at once. Desmond staggered back a step, his mouth opening and closing without producing a single sound. His brain was completely short-circuiting, unable to process why the head of security at his most prestigious country club was bowing to the daughter he had just discarded. Chantel clutched Connor's arm, her manicured nails digging so deep into his expensive suit jacket that he actually flinched. Connor's smug, patronizing smile slowly slid off his face entirely, replaced by a creeping, paralyzing dread. The venture capitalist standing behind him exchanged sharp, calculating glances, realizing instantly that the woman standing before them was not a hysterical postpartum sister-in-law. She was someone with enough raw capital to buy an entire country club just to make an entrance. I did not acknowledge Desmond's sputtering shock or Chantel's terrified stare. I looked directly at Connor, locking my eyes onto his. The absolute silence in the ballroom amplified my voice, ensuring every single wealthy investor hanging on his every word heard my next sentence with crystal clarity. "I am not here for the champagne, Connor," I said, tightening my grip on the blood-red leather dossier in my hand. "I am here to conduct a forensic audit." The absolute silence in the grand ballroom felt heavy enough to crush bone. I did not wait for Connor to find his voice. I turned my back on his pale, sweating face and walked deliberately toward the primary VIP table located right at the edge of the dance floor. The table was draped in white silk and covered in silver platters of caviar, but the three Silicon Valley venture capitalists seated around it were no longer paying attention to the extravagant food. They were staring at me with a mixture of intense curiosity and rising apprehension. I stepped up to the head of the table, my security detail fanning out to ensure no country club staff or panicked family members could interfere. Mr. Sterling stood perfectly poised at my right shoulder, projecting an aura of lethal corporate authority. I placed the blood-red leather folder flat against the glass surface of the table, pushing aside a half-empty bottle of vintage champagne to make room. The sharp snap of the metal clasp, echoing in the quiet space, sounded like a gunshot. Connor scrambled up to the table behind me, his breathing shallow and rapid. He tried to force a patronizing chuckle, putting his hands up in a placating gesture toward his lead investor, a silver-haired man named Preston. Connor stammered out an apology to Preston, claiming that I was clearly unwell and promising to get me medical attention right away. He begged the investors not to let this family drama distract them from the term sheet they were just discussing. I ignored his pathetic scrambling entirely. I opened the heavy red cover and pulled out the first stack of legal documents. They were printed on thick premium parchment, bearing the undeniable official seal of Apex Capital and the Fulton County Superior Court. I dropped the stack of bank foreclosure notices directly onto the center of the VIP table, letting the pages fan out across the white silk. I announced to the surrounding crowd that there would be no term sheet because they could not invest in an enterprise funded entirely by a bankrupt and insolvent guarantor. I looked directly at Preston, tapping the top document with my index finger. I explained that my father Desmond had been pitching himself to them all evening as a titan of commercial real estate, offering his own corporate portfolio as leverage to back Connor's venture. What he conveniently forgot to mention was that his entire real estate empire was drowning in toxic high-interest debt. Desmond pushed his way to the edge of the table, his eyes bugging out as he stared at the foreclosure notices bearing his own signature. His chest heaved violently under his expensive tuxedo. I pointed to the itemized list of liabilities, ensuring the investors could see the staggering columns of red ink. I told them that Desmond had over-leveraged every single property he owned, taking out predatory bridge loans to maintain this artificial country club lifestyle. I revealed that he had even remortgaged the very estate where he threw me into a blizzard last night, just to pay for the ice sculptures melting on this table. I then delivered the fatal blow, declaring that as of 3 hours ago, my private equity firm, Apex Capital, had purchased every single one of those delinquent notes. I had executed the acceleration clause this afternoon, meaning Desmond's company was completely insolvent and his assets were currently being seized. He was ruined. A collective gasp rippled through the audience of wealthy onlookers. Desmond stumbled backward, clutching the edge of a chair to keep from collapsing. His mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. The illusion of his generational wealth had just been publicly shattered into a million irreparable pieces. But I was not finished. I reached back into the red folder and pulled out the second, much thicker stack of papers. This was the forensic cybersecurity audit authorized by the Harrison Trust. I picked up the heavy binding and handed it directly into Preston's hands. The venture capitalist took the document, his brow furrowing as he read the bold executive summary printed on the first page. Connor lunged forward, desperately trying to snatch the audit out of Preston's hands. He shouted that the documents were confidential proprietary information, claiming that I was a jealous, bitter single mother, trying to sabotage his livelihood, and that the papers were forged. Elias stepped forward instantly, his massive hand clamping down on Connor's shoulder with enough force to make the tech bro cry out in pain and drop his arm. I calmly instructed Preston to read page 4, telling him that he was about to wire $20 million in seed funding to a man who did not possess a single line of proprietary code. I exposed the fact that the revolutionary algorithm Connor had been pitching all night was stolen directly from an open-source developer framework on GitHub. Connor had completely stripped the original licensing, slapped a minimalist user interface on top of it, and claimed it as his own intellectual property. Preston flipped rapidly to page 4, his eyes scanning the technical breakdown provided by my elite cybersecurity team. His face hardened as the reality of the deception set in. The other two investors leaned over his shoulder, their expressions turning to pure outrage. I told them the stolen code was just the foundation of the scam and directed them to page 9 to review the user acquisition metrics. Connor had claimed to have a highly engaged, daily active user base, generating millions of organic interactions to prove his market viability. I announced that the audit proved over 80% of his entire user base consisted of sophisticated bot farms purchased through illegal offshore accounts in Eastern Europe. The engagement was completely artificial and the growth trajectory was a fabricated lie. Taking a step closer to the VIP table, I ensured every word struck like a physical blow. I revealed that to artificially inflate the revenue streams and make the company look profitable. Desmond had secretly funneled the last remaining cash reserves from his dying real estate business directly into Connor's operational accounts. They were running a sophisticated shell game where Connor doctored the analytics dashboards before presenting them to the venture capital firm. I warned the investors that this was not a failed startup, but active massive-scale wire fraud. If they signed that term sheet tonight, they would be funding a criminal enterprise and tying their firm to a federal investigation. Preston slammed the forensic audit down onto the table with a sharp sound that made Chantel jump out of her skin from where she stood shivering a few feet away. Preston stood up his chair, scraping harshly against the hardwood floor. He looked at Connor with an expression of absolute undisguised disgust. Preston growled at Connor, calling him an arrogant punk for sitting in his office and pitching a stolen product. He was furious that Connor tried to leverage his firm's capital to pay off his father-in-law's gambling debts. Preston vowed to make absolutely certain that Connor would never secure a single dime in Silicon Valley for the rest of his miserable life, and promised that his legal team would be contacting the authorities before his flight left Atlanta. The two other investors stood up immediately, grabbing their coats and briefcases, throwing venomous glares at Connor and Desmond. The deal was dead. The empire was burned to the ground. The wealthy guests surrounding us began to aggressively back away, whispering fiercely to one another, pulling out their phones to text their brokers and social circles. Desmond and Connor were suddenly toxic radioactive waste in the middle of a high society ballroom. Connor fell to his knees beside the VIP table, burying his face in his hands, sobbing a pathetic broken sound that echoed the total destruction of his fraudulent reality. Chantel stared at him in horror, her perfect silver dress suddenly looking like a cheap costume. She realized in a fraction of a second that the wealthy, untouchable lifestyle she had worshipped was entirely gone. She was married to a broke, disgraced criminal. I stood in the center of the carnage, completely untouched by the wreckage, feeling a profound, soaring sense of vindication. I had protected my son and my grandfather's legacy, taking the very people who tried to destroy me and forcing them to choke on their own poison. But the execution was not quite complete. From the shadows of the retreating crowd, a high-pitched feral scream tore through the ballroom. I turned my head just in time to see my mother Yvonne charging through the circle of guests. Her perfectly styled hair was disheveled, and her eyes were wide with pure, unadulterated madness. The realization that her entire social standing, her country club memberships, her designer clothes, and her elite reputation were instantly evaporating into thin air had completely broken her mind. She could not accept that the daughter she had treated like dirt was the architect of her destruction. Yvonne shrieked that I was a jealous, lying fraud, her voice cracking with hysteria as she closed the distance between us. She screamed that I had printed out a bunch of fake papers because I could not stand that my sister was better than me, and accused me of always being a bitter, pathetic failure. She lunged directly at me, her hands raised like claws aiming straight for my face to physically tear me down. Yvonne launched herself across the polished dance floor like a feral animal completely stripped of her country club refinement. Her designer heels slipped slightly against the hardwood, but her momentum carried her forward. Her hands were curled into claws aiming directly for my face. She wanted to physically tear me down because she could not psychologically process the reality of her own destruction. She shrieked that I had fabricated the bank documents because I could not stand seeing Chantel succeed. She screamed that I was a bitter, pathetic failure trying to ruin my betters. I did not flinch. I did not take a single step backward or raise my hands to defend myself. Elias moved with a terrifying, silent efficiency. My lead security operative stepped directly into her path, catching her by the upper arms and completely absorbing her impact without breaking a sweat. Two other operatives moved in instantly, forming a solid wall of tailored muscle between me and my mother. Yvonne thrashed against them, kicking and spitting completely, losing her mind as she realized her entire social standing was evaporating into thin air. I watched my mother fight against my security detail and felt nothing but profound pity. She was willing to humiliate herself publicly just to protect a lie. I pulled my phone from my clutch. Earlier today, when my private equity firm finalized the hostile takeover of this country club, my technical team granted me master administrator access to the entire building network. I bypassed the hired audio-visual team, who were standing by the stage staring open-mouthed at the chaos unfolding in the ballroom. With 3 deliberate taps on my screen, I overrode the local sound system and paired my device directly to the grand ballroom's high-definition surround sound speakers. I pressed play. A sharp static crackle echoed through the massive room, instantly silencing the whispers of the wealthy guests. Then a crisp, crystal-clear audio recording filled the space. It was a conversation intercepted by my grandfather's corporate espionage team just 2 weeks ago. Connor's arrogant voice boomed from the speakers mounted along the vaulted ceilings. The audio was unmistakable. "I got them hooked," Connor boasted on the recording, his voice echoing loudly. "These Silicon Valley guys are absolutely clueless. You just throw a few buzzwords at them like machine learning and scalable architecture and they open their wallets. Preston is a complete dinosaur. He would not know a line of code if it bit him. I literally copied the framework from a free forum this morning, and he thinks I am the next tech visionary." A collective gasp rippled through the ballroom. The wealthy attendees turned their eyes toward Preston, who stood frozen by the VIP table. The color drained from his face, rapidly replaced by a deep, furious red. Then my father's voice joined the recording. Desmond sounded incredibly smug, boasting about his own deceptive brilliance. "That is my boy," Desmond said. "We just need to squeeze that $20 million seed money out of them tonight. Once Preston wires the holding fee, I will quietly reroute the capital to pay off the overdue mortgages on the commercial properties. We just need to keep the illusion alive long enough for their checks to clear. The bank is breathing down my neck, but these gullible cash cows are going to bail us out perfectly." The recording continued playing Connor, bragging about the offshore bot farms and how he had paid hackers in Eastern Europe to fabricate the user acquisition numbers. He joked about how easy it was to steal from rich old men who wanted to feel relevant in the tech industry. I disconnected the Bluetooth, leaving the ballroom in a state of absolute suffocating silence for one brief second. Then the room descended into total bedlam. The recording proved premeditated criminal intent beyond a shadow of a doubt. This was not a failing startup making mistakes. This was a highly coordinated conspiracy to commit massive-scale wire fraud. Preston shoved his chair back so violently, it tipped over and crashed loudly onto the floor. He marched right up to Connor, who was still kneeling on the ground, and grabbed him by the lapels of his expensive tuxedo, pulling him upward. Preston roared that he was calling the federal authorities and the Securities and Exchange Commission right this second. The other two investors joined in, crowding around Connor and demanding their initial holding fees back immediately. They promised to tie Connor up in litigation until he rotted in a federal prison cell. They shouted that they would personally ensure he never secured a single dime in any industry for the rest of his miserable life. The social ruin happening around us was absolute. The elite Atlanta socialites, the exact people my parents had spent decades trying to impress, were now actively backing away, like my family was contagious. Wealthy guests were pulling out their phones, recording the spectacular collapse of Desmond's empire, and texting the scandal to everyone in their networks. The pristine Winter Wonderland gala had violently morphed into a chaotic crime scene. Chantel was sobbing uncontrollably, her mascara running dark streaks down her face as she realized her wealthy friends were filming her profound humiliation. The untouchable lifestyle she had worshipped was entirely gone. Yvonne finally stopped struggling against my security guards, her body going completely limp. She slid to her knees on the hardwood floor, staring blankly ahead as the reality of her total social and financial destruction settled over her. The kingdom was officially burned to the ground, but Desmond refused to accept defeat. He realized he was losing everything all at once. His reputation, his assets, his freedom were all evaporating in front of his eyes. Sweating profusely and visibly shaking, he broke away from the crowd and scrambled onto the small platform where a string quartet had been playing earlier. He grabbed a microphone from the microphone stand, creating a loud burst of feedback that made people cover their ears. Desmond tried to shout over the angry investors and panicked guests, his voice cracking with sheer desperation. "Listen to me," he screamed, holding his hands up. "This is all a massive misunderstanding. This is a vicious setup by a disgruntled, estranged daughter. She forged those papers and faked that audio because she is mentally unwell. I swear to you, my companies are completely solvent. We have the capital to cover every single dime of your investments." Preston yelled back, calling Desmond a pathetic liar and demanding his money immediately. The crowd murmured in agreement, sensing blood in the water. Desmond puffed out his chest, projecting a false bravado as he played what he believed was his ultimate trump card. "Everything is fine," he shouted into the microphone, pointing a shaking finger at the investors. "You do not need to panic because my father's estate is executing the reading of the will tonight at midnight. I am the sole heir to the Harrison Logistics empire. I will be inheriting billions of dollars in a matter of hours. I can make everyone here completely whole. You will all get your money and a premium return. Just wait until midnight." Desmond stood on the stage, breathing heavily, looking out at the hostile room with wild, desperate eyes. He truly believed he still had a lifeline. He thought his father's money would wash away his sins and restore his crown. He had absolutely no idea that the executioner was already standing in the room. A cold, genuine laugh erupted from deep within my chest. It started low, a soft vibration of pure disbelief at the sheer magnitude of his delusion, and amplified into a sharp, resonant sound that sliced through the chaotic shouting of the ballroom. The wealthy investors paused, turning their heads to look at me. The panicked socialites stopped whispering. Even my mother, who was still trembling in the grip of my security detail, ceased her frantic struggling. My father stood on the small, elevated stage, gripping the microphone stand with white knuckles. He was sweating profusely, his expensive tuxedo jacket clinging awkwardly to his shoulders. He heard my laughter and his face twisted into a mask of pure venom. He pointed a trembling finger down at me, attempting to project the absolute authority he had used to terrorize our family for decades. "Do not dare laugh at me, Zaria," he shouted, his voice echoing harshly through the speakers. "You are a bitter, jealous outsider who has contributed nothing to this family legacy. You are trying to sabotage a multi-million-dollar deal because you are desperate for attention. But it does not matter. None of your pathetic little stunts matter. The Harrison Empire belongs to me. My father built a dynasty, and tonight at midnight, that dynasty officially passes into my hands. Every single investor in this room will be made completely whole with interest." I did not stop smiling. I took a slow, deliberate step toward the stage, the emerald silk of my custom gown moving fluidly around my ankles. My security team maintained their flawless perimeter, parting the sea of stunned guests as I advanced. You really believe that I asked, projecting my voice, so every person in the room could hear the absolute certainty in my tone. You really believe Grandad Harrison, a man who built his fortune, brick by brick through relentless hard work and unbreakable integrity, would hand his entire legacy over to a man who pawns his wife's jewelry just to pay for ice sculptures? Desmond sneered, leaning into the microphone. He was my father. I am his only son. He knew I was the only one capable of carrying the Harrison name into the next century. You are just a single mother who pushes spreadsheets for a living. You have no idea how real power operates. Now, security, throw her out before she ruins this event any further. I did not even glance at the country club guards who were still standing frozen in the corners of the room, fully aware that my private equity firm now owned their paychecks. Instead, I raised my right hand and signaled toward the grand double doors at the back of the ballroom. The heavy wooden doors swung open with a resounding thud. A tall, distinguished older African-American man stepped into the warm light of the ballroom. Mr. Sterling walked with the measured, lethal grace of a man who had spent 40 years dismantling corporate empires in federal courtrooms. He wore an immaculate navy bespoke suit, carrying a heavy black leather briefcase that looked like it contained the fate of nations. A ripple of immediate recognition swept through the older, wealthier guests in the room. They knew exactly who he was. They knew he was the managing partner of the most powerful corporate law firm in the Southeast, and Grandad Harrison's most trusted personal attorney. His presence alone carried more weight than every single one of Desmond's flashy country club memberships combined. Desmond spotted him walking down the center aisle, and his entire posture shifted. His panicked, desperate demeanor instantly transformed into a sickening display of arrogant relief. He truly believed his salvation had just walked through the doors. Sterling, my father, yelled over the murmuring crowd, waving his hand frantically toward the stage. Thank God you are here. Get up here and tell these people, tell these investors about the trust. Tell them about the liquidity that unlocks at midnight. This ungrateful girl is trying to cause a panic, but you can clear this all up right now. Tell them I am good for the 20 million. Mr. Sterling did not acknowledge my father's frantic gesturing. He did not speed up his pace. He walked directly toward me, stopping exactly one step behind my right shoulder. He did not look at Desmond like a grieving son. He looked at him like a foreclosure notice. I held my hand out. Mr. Sterling smoothly handed me the secondary microphone he had retrieved from the audio-visual table in the back. I tapped it once, ensuring it was live. You want Mr. Sterling to address your investors? I asked, my voice carrying a lethal calm that made the surrounding venture capitalists lean in closer. You want him to verify your financial standing to the very people you just tried to defraud with stolen software. That is incredibly brave of you, Desmond. I think that is a fantastic idea. I stepped aside, gesturing for Mr. Sterling to take the floor. The esteemed attorney stepped forward, his posture completely rigid, his expression utterly devoid of warmth. He looked out over the sea of wealthy elites, the furious investors, and the shattered remnants of my family. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Mr. Sterling began, his rich, authoritative voice commanding absolute silence across the grand ballroom. For those who do not know me, my name is Marcus Sterling. For the past 40 years, I served as the primary legal counsel and personal confidant to the late Mr. Harrison. I am the sole executor of the Harrison estate and the managing trustee of his entire corporate and personal portfolio. Desmond puffed out his chest, standing tall on the stage. He shot a smug, triumphant glare down at me, fully expecting to be crowned king in front of Atlanta high society. Chantel, who had been sobbing on the floor next to her disgraced husband Connor, suddenly scrambled to her feet. She wiped the running mascara from her cheeks and hurried over to the edge of the stage, clinging to Desmond's pant leg like a desperate child. They were entirely convinced they were about to be vindicated. Mr. Sterling adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses, staring directly at my father. Desmond, you have spent the entire evening making aggressive, unauthorized claims regarding the timeline and the distribution of your late father's assets. You have leveraged the promise of an impending inheritance to secure fraudulent business deals and predatory loans. My father shifted uncomfortably, his smug smile faltering just a fraction. Sterling, what are you talking about? Just tell them about the midnight distribution. Tell them the money is secured. Mr. Sterling opened the brass clasps of his heavy leather briefcase. The sharp clicks echoed loudly in the quiet room. There will be no midnight distribution, Desmond. Mr. Sterling announced, his voice dropping into a register of pure, unadulterated ice. The original timeline for the execution of the trust was contingent upon the stability of the family assets. However, due to the extreme financial misconduct, the active wire fraud, and the impending criminal investigations witnessed in this very room tonight, the emergency contingencies of the blind trust have been formally activated. A sharp gasp escaped from Chantel's lips. My mother, who was still being detained by my security detail, let out a low, agonizing moan. I do not understand. Desmond stammered, his hands gripping the microphone stand so tightly his knuckles turned white. What emergency contingencies? I am the sole male heir. The entire estate defaults to me. I need that capital to cover the commercial mortgages. You have absolutely no authority to dictate the terms of this estate. Mr. Sterling fired back, shutting down my father's desperate plea with clinical precision. As the executor, I am fully authorized to accelerate the legal proceedings to protect the legacy of my client. There is absolutely no need to wait until midnight. I am executing the public reading of the final binding allocations right here, right now. The room held its collective breath. The venture capitalists who had been demanding their seed money back crossed their arms, watching the spectacle with rapt attention. They knew they were witnessing a historic corporate slaughter. Desmond swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing nervously against his tight tuxedo collar. But then his deeply ingrained narcissism took over. He simply could not compute a reality where he was not the victor. He straightened his spine, pulling his shoulders back and lifting his chin. He looked out at the crowd, plastering a fake, confident smile on his face. He truly believed that his father, despite their differences, would never leave his only son destitute. I believed the old man loved the family name too much to let it fall into ruin. Desmond looked down at me, a disgusting sneer twisting his features. He leaned away from the microphone, lowering his voice so only those closest to the stage could hear his venom. You thought you had me, Zarya, he whispered, his eyes gleaming with malicious triumph. You thought your little folder of bank notices was going to ruin my life. You are nothing. You are a single mother with a worthless job who could not even keep a man. My father is about to hand me the keys to a $2.5 billion kingdom. I am going to use my first executive action to ensure you and that bastard child of yours never see a single dime. You will be on the streets by tomorrow morning. I did not blink. I did not react to his vile, cruel threats regarding my newborn son. I just smiled, a slow, terrifying smile that made the false confidence in his eyes waver. Mr. Sterling reached into his briefcase and pulled out a thick document bound in heavy premium parchment. It bore the unmistakable gold foil seal of the Harrison Trust. He placed it carefully onto the pristine white tablecloth of the VIP table, right next to my red leather dossier of financial ruin. Mr. Sterling adjusted his glasses one final time, looking down at the heavy legal text. He cleared his throat, and the entire ballroom braced for the impact. He began to read the final binding allocations of a man who built an empire and refused to let a parasite burn it down. The heavy parchment paper crackled sharply in the dead silence of the ballroom. Mr. Sterling cleared his throat, his voice projecting with the practiced cadence of a seasoned litigator. I, being of sound mind and absolute clarity of judgment, do hereby revoke all previous wills and codicils. Mr. Sterling read the opening lines of my grandfather's final testament. The words struck the room like the tolling of a heavy bell. Desmond stood on the stage, his chest puffed out, an arrogant smirk practically glued to his sweating face. He was literally vibrating with anticipation, ready to be crowned the new king of Atlanta society. Mr. Sterling did not even glance up from the page. I leave my primary commercial real estate holdings, my global logistics fleet, and the entirety of the Harrison private equity portfolio to the only person in this bloodline who possesses the intellect and the spine to protect it. The sum of these assets, currently valued at $2.5 billion, is hereby transferred in its absolute entirety to my granddaughter Zarya Harrison. A collective gasp sucked all the oxygen out of the grand ballroom. The venture capitalists who had been screaming for their money just moments ago froze in their tracks. The elite socialites stared at me with wide, terrified eyes. Desmond staggered backward, as if he had been physically struck in the chest by a sledgehammer. "No," he gasped, gripping the microphone stand to keep his knees from buckling. "That is a mistake. Read it again, Sterling. You read it wrong. I am his son. He promised me the empire." Mr. Sterling lowered the document and looked my father dead in the eye. "I read it exactly as your father dictated it, Desmond. He was incredibly specific regarding your portion of the estate." Mr. Sterling flipped to the second page of the testament. "To my son Desmond, whose profound financial incompetence and moral bankruptcy have been a source of constant disappointment, I leave the exact sum of $1. I leave this token amount to explicitly demonstrate that my exclusion of him is not an oversight, but a deliberate calculated rejection of his character." Desmond collapsed. His knees simply gave out beneath him, and he crashed into a folding chair on the stage, clutching his chest as he gasped for air. His perfectly tailored tuxedo twisted awkwardly around his slumping frame. The illusion of the powerful, untouchable patriarch shattered, completely exposing the pathetic, debt-ridden fraud hiding underneath. The shockwave of the announcement hit Connor next. The arrogant white tech bro who had mocked my postpartum exhaustion just last night suddenly realized that his entire gravy train had violently derailed. The billionaire father-in-law he had relied on to bail out his criminal enterprise was now officially destitute. Connor looked frantically at the venture capitalists, who were already dialing their legal teams. Then he looked at the exit doors blocked by my private security. Cornered and desperate, Connor did what every parasitic opportunist does when the ship starts sinking. He turned on his host. Connor spun around and pointed a trembling finger directly at my sister Chantel. "It was her idea," Connor screamed, his voice cracking with sheer panic. "I never wanted to falsify the user metrics. Chantel forced me to do it. She told me her father would cover our tracks if we just faked the data long enough to get the seed money. She spent all the operational funds on her designer clothes and her luxury cars. I am a victim here. She manipulated me." Chantel stared at her husband in absolute horror, her jaw dropping open. The flawless, superficial marriage they had paraded around the country club for years disintegrated in seconds. "You lying coward," Chantel shrieked, her voice echoing shrilly through the ballroom. "You begged my father to mortgage his house for you. You said we would be billionaires by Christmas. Do not you dare try to pin your wire fraud on me." They began screaming at each other, hurling venomous accusations and exposing every toxic transactional detail of their relationship to the stunned crowd. Connor called her a gold-digging parasite, and Chantel slapped him across the face so hard the sound cracked like a whip. Their perfect union was nothing but two scammers turning on each other the second the money dried up. I stepped closer to the stage, the emerald silk of my gown rustling softly against the hardwood floor. I looked down at my father, who was still slumped in the chair, clutching his chest and staring at the floor with hollow, defeated eyes. "You threw your newborn grandson into a blizzard," I told him, my voice dropping to a freezing, lethal whisper that cut through the sound of Chantel and Connor screaming at each other. "You looked at my child and decided he was an inconvenience to your fraudulent networking mixer. You told me to take a bus to a homeless shelter. Now I am throwing you out of my buildings." Desmond slowly raised his head, his eyes bloodshot and filled with a terrifying mixture of rage and terror. "You cannot do this, Zarya," he wheezed, struggling to catch his breath. "This is my club. This is my event. I am your father." "You are a tenant in default," I corrected him sharply, "and your lease just expired." I signaled to Elias, who immediately raised his wrist to his mouth and spoke a single command into his radio. The heavy double doors of the ballroom flew open. A squad of uniformed Atlanta police officers marched into the room, their utility belts rattling in the tense silence. They were accompanied by a team of federal agents from the Securities and Exchange Commission, who had been briefed by my legal team hours ago regarding Connor's massive wire fraud. The country club guests scrambled out of the way, pressing their backs against the walls as the authorities moved decisively across the dance floor. The lead police officer stepped up to the stage, unholstering a pair of steel handcuffs. He did not look at me. He looked directly at Desmond and Connor. "Desmond, Harrison, and Connor, you are both being escorted off the premises." the officer announced, his voice booming with absolute authority. "We have active warrants for your arrest regarding multiple counts of corporate fraud and theft by deception. Put your hands behind your backs immediately." Yvonne, who had been sitting paralyzed on the floor, suddenly scrambled to her feet. She rushed toward me, her expensive pearls swinging wildly around her neck. "Zarya, please," Yvonne begged, tears streaming through her ruined makeup. "You have to stop this. Tell them it is a mistake. We are your family. We are the Harrisons. You cannot let them take us away in front of all these people." I looked at the woman who had handed me a $20 bill and told me to freeze to death just to teach me a lesson. "I do not know what you are talking about, Yvonne," I said, my tone completely devoid of emotion. "The Harrisons are doing just fine. I am a Harrison. You are just a woman who pawned her jewelry to buy ice sculptures you cannot afford." Chantel lunged towards me, pushing past the arresting officers. "Zarya, you have to give me access to my trust fund," Chantel sobbed, grabbing the sleeve of my gown with her shaking manicured hands. "Connor maxed out all my credit cards. I do not have a single dollar to my name. I cannot go to jail. Please just unlock my trust fund. I am your sister." I smoothly pulled my arm out of her grasp, smoothing the emerald silk with meticulous care. "You do not have a trust fund," Chantel, I informed her, watching the realization hit her eyes. "Grandad Harrison liquidated your accounts 2 years ago when you crashed that third Mercedes. The money you have been spending for the last 24 months was stolen directly from Desmond's dying real estate company. You drained your own inheritance to fund a scam. You have absolutely nothing left." The police officers moved in, securing the handcuffs around Desmond's and Connor's wrists. The metallic clicks echoed loudly, cementing their total downfall. Connor was actively weeping, begging the federal agents for a plea deal before they even read him his rights. Desmond stared straight ahead, his face completely devoid of color, a broken, shattered man being paraded in front of the very high society elites he had sacrificed his own daughter to impress. The officers escorted them out of the ballroom. My private security detail moved in behind them, forcing Yvonne and Chantel to follow the procession. They were led through the grand foyer of the country club, the exact same venue where they had spent years mocking my career and treating me like an outcast. The wealthy guests pulled out their phones, recording every humiliating second of the Harrison family eviction. The heavy glass doors of the country club slid open, exposing them to the brutal, unforgiving winter storm raging outside. The freezing wind immediately whipped through their thin, expensive gala outfits. Yvonne shivered violently, wrapping her arms around her bare shoulders as the sub-zero temperatures bit into her skin. Chantel stumbled in her silver designer heels, struggling to walk down the iced-over cobblestone driveway. They had stripped me of my dignity and thrown me out into this exact same storm less than a day ago. Now they were the ones standing in the freezing night, stripped of their cars, their home, their status, and their freedom. The investors, standing safely inside the warm ballroom, openly discussed pressing aggressive federal charges, ensuring Connor and Desmond would never see the outside of a prison cell for decades. I watched them shiver in the snow from the warmth of my newly acquired country club, and I felt absolutely no remorse. The legal hammer fell with brutal, unprecedented speed over the next 3 weeks. Connor was federally indicted for massive wire fraud and grand larceny. The evidence my cybersecurity team handed over to the authorities was so overwhelmingly comprehensive that his public defender advised him to plead guilty immediately. Chantel filed for divorce the very next morning, desperately trying to distance herself from the criminal fallout, but the damage was already permanently done. Because she had signed as a guarantor on several of his predatory business loans, she was legally tethered to his massive debts. Her designer wardrobe, her luxury bags, and her remaining jewelry were all seized and liquidated by the bankruptcy courts. Desmond and Yvonne were utterly and completely ostracized from Atlanta's elite black society. The country club formally revoked their memberships, erasing their names from the plaques in the history books. Their high society friends, the people they had sacrificed their own daughter to impress, stopped returning their calls and actively crossed the street to avoid them. With the family estate successfully foreclosed and seized by my private equity firm, my parents were forced to move into a cramped, run-down 2-bedroom apartment complex on the outskirts of the city. A few weeks after the eviction, my private secure phone line rang. I was sitting at the massive marble kitchen island in my penthouse, reviewing the quarterly projections for the logistics fleet. I answered the call, putting it on speakerphone while I typed on my laptop. Zaria, please do not hang up. Yvonne's voice came through the speaker, thin, desperate, and fractured by constant crying. It is your mother. Please, we have nothing left. The apartment is freezing and Desmond cannot find work anywhere. I just want to see my beloved grandson. Please let me see Trey. I will do anything. Let me come over and we can be a family again. She was trying to manipulate her way back into the money using my son as a bargaining chip. She thought she could weaponize my maternal instincts just like she had tried to weaponize the bank against me. I did not raise my voice. I did not sigh or offer a single syllable of explanation. I reached out and tapped the red button on the screen, ending the call instantly. I opened the security settings and permanently blocked the number, completely erasing her voice from my life forever. I closed my laptop and walked into the grand living room. The fireplace was roaring, casting a warm, beautiful light across the imported hardwood floors. I walked down the hall to the state-of-the-art nursery where Trey was sleeping peacefully in his crib, surrounded by absolute security and unconditional love. I stood over him, tracing the soft curve of his cheek with my finger. I looked out the floor-to-ceiling windows over the sprawling Atlanta skyline. The winter storm had passed, leaving the city clear and bright under the night sky. I reflected on the massive empire I now controlled, the billions in the bank, the shipping fleets, and the towering commercial high-rises. But the true power I felt in that moment had nothing to do with the money. I had achieved absolute true independence. I did not just inherit a fortune, I inherited my grandfather's unbreakable resilience. The toxic generational curse of the Harrison family was officially broken. My son would grow up knowing nothing but strength, respect, and genuine love. They threw me into the cold, expecting me to freeze. They did not know I was the one who controlled the weather. Looking back on the night I stood in that freezing blizzard, I realized the greatest inheritance my grandfather left me was not the billions of dollars in my bank account. It was the unbreakable resilience to walk away from a table where respect was no longer being served. For years, I let my biological family dictate my worth, believing their conditional love was the best I could hope for. But true family does not throw you out into the cold when you become inconvenient. They do not trade your dignity to fund their superficial illusions. I learned that you cannot heal in the same toxic environment that broke you. Sometimes the most profound act of self-love is tearing down the old foundations and building your own empire from the ground up. I broke the generational curse that night, ensuring my son will never know what it feels like to beg for a place in his own home. He will grow up knowing that true power comes from integrity and independence. Have you ever had to walk away from toxic relatives to protect your own peace and build your own success? I would love to hear how you found your strength, so share your journey with me in the comments below. If my story resonated with you, please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel for more stories about reclaiming your power. Remember, your worth is never defined